We're going to be discussing the idea of the false binary.
What an illusion of choice does, it establishes the baseline assumptions that nobody questions.
This is part of the fifth generation warfare that we've talked about. Voting for the lesser of two evils. It's definitely an emotional, psychological trap that people are in.
You're cheerleading for an insane ideology because you think you're winning.
The role we have as media, how do we help everybody understand this is theater and you need to get back into the real world?
If you're opposed to the agenda, you should oppose it regardless of who's selling it to you.
Welcome to another panel brought to you by the Independent Media Alliance. We're here today to discuss the Iran war and the justifications for it, the conversation of global implications, and just about another 15, 30 different possible connections to this very large story. So just to frame, to start in general, a great article was written by Kit Knightley. A history in four psyops. Has Iran always been a member of the club? Just heads up, guys, I'm still getting a little feedback from somebody's mic. Just keep muted while we're going around. It's an important framing of this, right? And the idea of whether this is a larger conversation, just one country being taken, attacked, or it's a larger kind of transition of society. I think it's an important thought to have. But so today we're coming together to discuss what all this means and what the implications may be. And so I'd like to start personally. And as always, guys, we can go wherever we'd like. But I want to start by reading off something that Ian put in the chat. He's unable to make it today, Ian Davis. And so I wanted to read off what he put forward as a good thought. And then we can get in, really just kind of start with where this kicked off in the first place with Rubio's statements and the ideas of the potential for Israel acting and how that all kind of kicked it off. But first, I'll read his statements. To question a war is not to claim it is fake. To doubt the casus belli, to consider the wider implications, and to ask who benefits is not to downplay the human cost. Taking a side in a war may be unavoidable, simply as a matter of self-preservation. It may even be the moral position. But history shows us that wars are not fought for moral reasons. Finance, economics, political ambition, disputes over land and other resources have commonly been the causes of war. Rarely has a war been waged for humanitarian reasons, and human beings always suffer as a result of war. While millions have died and the worst atrocities have been committed in wars always benefit some. Consistently, they further empower and enrich a tiny class of oligarchs and financiers. History also teaches us that the same class has manipulated populations and consciously engineered wars for their own benefit. It is naive beyond measure to ever automatically assume that alleged hostilities between nation states or their proxies supposedly triggering war are the real or the only explanations for international conflicts. If we repeatedly fall into the trap of simply supporting one side or another, we are not thinking critically about war, and if failing to do so, we are likely to condemn ourselves to more war without reason. Well put. So I'll throw it to whoever wants to jump in next about kind of the starting point on this. My thought was the Rubio statement of Israel maybe bombing first, so we had to react and how it's evolved, but take it where you will. Who wants to jump in?
I mean, I feel like the entire thing has been the propaganda version of mission creep since they started teasing it. Because originally, right, it was for the liberation of the oppressed Iranian women, the ever repetitive, we're 2 weeks from having Iran having a nuclear weapon is, something that was done ad nauseum. But now it's shifted from any of that. They're still trying the nuke nonsense, but it shifted mostly from that to, existential threat, or they were going to protect our partners or, attack our partners, to service members being told that they're there to protect American interests in the region. And to limit Iran's ability to become a superpower, which isn't our job. We have no mandate for, definitely isn't our business, and has nothing to do with the original propaganda and justification for bombing a sovereign nation in the first place.
Well, the vagueness has very much been like part of the exercise. Like, they're not clear on why they started the war. They're not even clear if it is a war. There was a debate about what they were going to call it. Some people refused to even call it a war to begin with. And vagueness is very useful in a propaganda exercise because it allows you to evolve as you go. You can start the war and stop the war on a dime if you haven't even told anybody why you started it.
Go
ahead.
I'll just add, I mean, we've all, this isn't our second rodeo, right? 2003 Iraq. And I just feel it's so clown world cartoonish. Like everything they say is on its face lies. And you know, just on steroids compared to 20 years ago. And so the official narrative is completely false on all levels, and something else is going on. And there's a lot of people chiming in saying Iran is Great Reset. It's the new COVID. So I think really that's to the heart of it.
Can we address the propaganda side of this? Because I'm not on social media, so I don't get inundated with this. But even just people contacting me directly through my website, I have had several people in the lead up to this war, and a couple of people even now, trying to convince me that, no, you don't understand, James. The Iranians want this, and they want regime change, and almost applauding it. I even got an email from someone who I've corresponded with before, who's a member of my website, who has told me that, well, I saw this on Facebook. It may be an AI-generated video, but this person seems to really be happy with what's going on right now. So maybe, as if we should justify the slaughter of innocents because I guess the Iranians want it. And America and Israel are really about regime change this time. I find it difficult to believe that any thinking human being is falling for any of this crap right now. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
I mean, can I just add in real quick? Ryan, I just dropped a link. If we can pop it on the screen, if we have a chance. There's actually a brand new article that came out from the Financial Times. It's directly addressing what James is saying. As far as the fact that surely we can find some Iranians who do support, or at least initially supported what the U.S. is doing. You can find many of them are expats in the U.S. who left and say, yeah, you know, you've seen the conservatives, the MAGA crowd going around showing these protests. And then, of course, there's people at home. This article that just came out today, it's showing how it interviews different Iranians in Iran. And of course, they're anonymous because they're trying to protect themselves. But it basically says that they're rethinking regime change and how they were initially like, okay, yes, if the U.S. is going to come and help us from our, government that plenty of the people don't like, as well as some who do like for whatever reason, that now they're like, okay, well, they're not just going after the government. They even say, how come Venezuela got a clean regime change and we're getting civilian bombings? Because for those who haven't got the message yet, the U.S. has been bombing desalination plants, schools, hospitals. And there's reports of at least 1,000 dead Iranian civilians, as far as what we're getting from that Financial Times article. And there's others, but it was kind of to your point, James, where it's saying some of them may have initially thought this was going to be in their favor. And then now they're like, okay, the U.S. and Trump's own words, Pete Hegseth said, we're punching them while they're down. And that's the way it should be. And they're like, we're going to destroy everything for generations to come. And this clearly isn't about trying to liberate them. They're trying to just destroy everything they can. So I think that's just an important thing, because you're right, James, there probably are AI generated propaganda videos. And then surely there's going to be some people who say, I do think this is good, and others who are against it, who are of Iranian descent. I was talking to an Iranian friend just a little bit ago about his opinions on it. And he said just as much, there's mixed opinions, like there are mixed opinions in America, right? For any issue. But it does seem like now some of those folks are starting to rethink their initial support.
But I would like to add, though, from my immediate impression, and those of us that have been following this long enough, like Hivore was pointing out, that we've been here before, and we've seen the lies build, and then we've seen the reality behind it when they fell back. And I think it's certainly possible today that there's more Iranians that support this than usual. But from day one on this version of it, I didn't believe that. I was open to the possibility. And then, of course, when you see the way that this went down, it started with the same old tactics, with the same, protest movements based on real things of real Iranians who were angry with certain things happening. And the unions were stepping in and supporting them. And the moment we started to see, masked foreign people, according to the Iranian people on the ground, according to the unions who pulled back and said, we no longer support this, it became clear there was outside elements. We have Mossad, we have even Pompeo, elements in the U.S. publicly saying they're arming these people. And so my point is, I think early in this, if not, it didn't even happen to begin with, that they had no support. And I think that's worth considering, that this was just completely whole cloth manipulation. But the point to always be made, I guarantee you there are some Iranians, whether because they're incentivized for one reason or another, or just because they think this is the right thing, who do support it. And we should always be okay saying that. But it's obvious, in my opinion, that it's not even close to the majority, if at all. I mean, even the Shah support is basically non-existent. And so that brings back the point of the propaganda, the need to lie to everybody, and then how that's succeeding. Because I'm with James and everyone else. I don't think this is affecting, I don't think anyone's buying this, like less than ever.
But I mean, isn't it a bit odd that that story is in the Financial Times already 10 days in?
Yeah.
I mean, somebody mentioned Iraq War 2003, and 10 days into the Iraq War 2003, there was no way a story like that appears in a mainstream paper.
But doesn't
No
that
way.
make the point, though, in a way? Like, I get your point. Is it possible that could be ultimately the and we should always be doing this as well? Are we falling for their narrative? Is this some kind of, psyop situation? My thought, though, is that that's because this is failing. Like, as always, the corporate media, the mainstream alternative, there's a level, they need some level of clout, some influence. And when these things fall on their face, there's usually a moment when it's sort of like showing you what we all kind of already know. That's how I'd read that. But what do you guys think?
So let me bring up the fact that it might not be failing. So I don't think Trump is running this. I don't think Trump has agency, and nor does the U.S. government have sovereignty. It's not. I mean, the central bankers control the cash flows. So what we've watched are three things going on in the Straits of Hormuz. You see Lloyd's of London and the city shut down traffic by shutting off the Western insurance. Now, that doesn't shut down all the ships, but it shuts up most of the trade. Then we see the Iranians saying they're going to shut down trade except for the boats they want to have go through. And we're watching now the United States, which has for the last 2 decades had $500 billion to $1 trillion a year of investment in military capacity, say that they can't keep the straits open, when in fact anybody who runs a reserve currency knows that if you don't control the sea lanes, you don't have a reserve currency. So the idea that the U.S. is not prepared to handle this is either the grossest of incompetence or somebody wants the straits closed. We just had Goldman Sachs predict the straits would be closed for another 21 days. That means no provision is going to get through to the fertilizer plants in the U.S. and Europe, and fertilizer won't be available for the planting season. And when it finally gets through, it's going to be too late. So whether you're looking at what it's going to do to the supply chains, that the energy is not flowing, or the materials for agriculture are not flowing, you're talking about something that could bring in a worldwide famine. And there are only two possible explanations. One is absolutely gross incompetence, or else somebody wants to do that.
I think on that last point, some of the headlines we've been seeing just the past week, Vietnam, Thailand, other Asian countries, Denmark, Europe, UK now are bringing back COVID era policies. Stay home,
right.
And work from home, getting us prepared for fuel rationing, food rationing. And so I think it's the latter. I think they're doing this intentionally.
Well, there's an important point to add to this, and I agree entirely with you, Catherine. The interesting point, though, is that Strait of Hormuz, as you kind of said there, is not actually closed. It's just restricted heavily based on threats, which is weird to me how roundly it's been reported that it was closed, like from the very beginning. And so it's interesting to think about that, because the traffic is still there. This is as of right now. But what you're saying is very important, Catherine, and I think that's the way they're playing this, is Iran is playing this very strategically. I think they know that if they shut this down, just blockade, the whole world will have issue with that, as opposed to just...
Right. So one of the reasons I'm so interested in Kit's latest article, which I think is very important, is I'm watching Iran and the City of London work together to throttle the trade through the straits, and that could last for a long, long time, with very dramatic implications on the ability of the people who rolled up all the small guys in Main Street during the pandemic, coming back and doing it in an exponential factor this time with this kind of lockdown.
And so you feel this is by design, as like a coordinated, like involving Iran kind of situation?
Not necessarily, because there could be other things at play. I do believe that ultimately this is the central bankers trying to move us into the control grid. So, and there could be many explanations, and the gross incompetence on the part of the U.S. military is a feasible possibility. So I'm not sure. And that's why I wanted Kit to describe his article, because I think it's very important to understand, for example, the role that Iran played during COVID.
Well, let's throw it to Kit then to discuss this, but I want to come back to how this ties back into what, the very idea of them being played in a way, and whether that's what we think this is. We can come back to the statement by Rubio, but I think the framing is important. So go ahead, Kit, if you'd like to discuss this. I mean, if you'd like to, we can go directly to the, oh, I'm sorry, you're muted, Kit. I'm sorry, you're muted.
Well, you'll never know what I said, but it was really interesting. I was just going to say on the Strait of Hormuz, I think it is clear that this was like the most powerful piece on the board. It was the point, because there was this strange push and pull of propaganda on it. Our press reported it was closed before Iran said they were going to close it. And then Iran said they weren't going to close it. And then the insurers basically forced it to be closed in a very strange move, probably the most interesting move of the war so far, a very odd thing to do. But then Trump said that he would cover the insurance. So there is clearly some push and pull in the Strait of Hormuz that makes it the most interesting aspect of what's going on. With regards to Iran's global role in COVID, that it was very, very important. If you go back to March 2020, Iran was the second country outside China to really take it seriously. It was the first or third after Italy to start racking up the numbers. And Iran's position in that pulled a lot of people from what I suppose you would call our world into accepting it as it was being presented at the time, because Iran wouldn't go along with a Western psyop. And I think Iran has played an interesting role in global psyops for a long time as an excuse to increase military spending, as the big enemy for Israel in the area. If they hadn't been there, there almost would have been a need to put them there. And there's a long history that we talked about for hours about that kind of thing. I'm not sure we should go into everything I wrote in the article, but from the installation, and this is something that was new to me when I started doing the research on it. It was obviously well before I was born, but the power swap from the Shah to the Ayatollah was very interesting. I had no idea how involved Western governments were in that before I started reading about it just last week. But yeah, it does create a different impression of Iran through the decades once you know that.
Right. I'm always so interested in Mossadegh before 53, and at least as it's written, it's hard to know for sure, but apparently was very enamored by Western culture, had pictures of himself by the Liberty Bell, was and it just turned out he wasn't the one willing to play ball. And so that's always the story, isn't it? Finding the groups that are willing to turn on their own people and claim that's the one that's, the good guy in the situation. But it's very
while you're setting up and establishing the opposition groups too.
Yeah, right.
So let me ask you a question, because
can I add one quick point, Catherine, to what you were saying?
Yeah.
I'll give it to you. Just to add to all what we're saying about the same thing with Strait of Hormuz. Another example of that, I just recently saw the point of Trump coming up and saying, no mines in the Strait. Hasn't happened yet. There's no indication of that, but no mines. Less than 24 hours later, there's mines being discovered. And I feel like it's like he's discussing or just suggesting that it's sort of being set up to seem as if they're doing more, when I don't feel like that's likely going to happen, what they are likely doing based on the way I see it anyway. So I think a lot of those things are happening, like Kit was saying. Go ahead, Catherine.
So one of the things I think which we really need to think about is that we have now seen the BRICS alliance bombing each other. So you have India make a very important deal with Israel that puts it sort of on the wrong side of the BRICS in this thing, or the wrong side of Russia and China. But then you have Iran bombing the UAE, which is a member of BRICS. So what does this do to the BRICS alliance?
Well, I guess the question is that even really a genuine resistance to the larger plan?
I think it is a genuine piece of the programmable money play. So Iran's on board for CBDC. And so I think pulling apart the payment systems the BRICS have been putting together and pushing them closer to other systems, this could absolutely be part of this.
Well, unless you want to continue on this vein, because there's so many directions we can go. The interesting part to bring it back to whether they were played, because one of the things that stood out to me that it needed to be highlighted for people that hadn't picked up on it was the narrative was essentially first that Israel was going to act, and so they were essentially, their calculus was we should have to act first before Iran bombs us after that. And so right there, even that was sort of the follow-up, even from the Republican side, was that's showing you right there that Israel's influencing policy. at least through Donald Trump, and we know it's bigger than that. I thought that was an important thing to see, that was their excuse to sort of make it seem like they had to do that. But then, where that really ended up, Rubio insinuating even nukes might be used. Then Trump came out and said that he actually acted first. And so I can play that clip to set that table. And then if we want to talk about that and whether we think Israel is in fact driving this, and then does that line to the same agenda?
So we have a commentary on the website that is, it's called Was Jeffrey Epstein the father of programmable money? And it's a very well done Substack by a guy who's writing under the synonym of ESC. And he does the best job I've ever seen of describing how the Rothschild network works. Now, I use the European pronunciation, so forgive me, the Rothschild network. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, so some of the Iranians have been calling this, referring to the U.S. administration as the Epstein syndicate. But I think of it as the Rothschild syndicate. And I point you to that Substack because it does such a great job of describing them. I think this administration is very much part of that syndicate, and has been for a long time. It comes very much related to the Epstein operation. I don't think that Trump and his people are making the key decisions here.
I completely agree with that. That's kind of where I was going with that, is the possibility. And even within that point, even if we're just going to agree that it's clear that Israel's the one deciding the actions, how does that fully flesh out?
So Israel, to me, Israel is like the pit bull on the leash of the guys who run the Rothschild syndicate. And they use that group to do a lot of the criminal work and a lot of the dirty tricks and whatever, but they're on a leash. They're not, the Rothschild syndicate is running this. That's the equity around the central banks. That's what's running this. And Israel is as psychopathic as they are, they're on a leash.
And so you think that is being, so in that scenario, then that's what's guiding or driving or forcing the Trump administration to act?
So let's go back to the money. The U.S. has $6 trillion a year of expenses, $4 trillion a year of revenues, $2 trillion coming directly from the banks, and part of that flow is going to Israel. How long can Israel go without that flow coming through from that pot of money? So who controls that pot of money? That's what we're looking at. And what do they need? What do they need to keep this game going?
I just wanted to add what Kit mentioned was interesting before we leave that. Apparently there's a quote from the Shah where he said, if you lift up Khomeini's beard, you will find "Made in England" written under his chin. But just to this point, I've found a lot of articles going back decades from Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs, talking about the need to create a Middle Eastern Union. And so I find the timing as well interesting, as we're witnessing in the Western Hemisphere. I thought this was crazy news. Last weekend, Hegseth came out and declared the Greater North America.
Yes.
And so the timing is also interesting. If they're rapidly working on the North American Union technate, that kind of seems like the timing here is interesting, because you go back and you'll find decades or more, Foreign Affairs saying we need to create an EU-like Middle Eastern Union and Middle Eastern NATO. And then to what everyone is saying, Iran is, everyone else is technocratic in the region, UAE, Saudi, Israel, Gaza now. And so they need to, and there was an article someone sent me from CFR last week that said, we need a technocratic opposition in Iran. So it's like they just need to, what they've done to Venezuela, what they're doing everywhere else to destroy the old order to bring in the new updated operating system of technocracy.
When I was setting this up, just the show and this, I wasn't sure where we were going to take this. My mind is obsessed with this topic, where this is going right now. Like, this is where I see everything leading, and I don't want to make it so it's obviously confirmation bias in some ways or whatever else, but this is every single thing I see going on in this conversation leads to that point right now. And it's not all the same necessary agenda. You could point to Zionism and Greater Israel and their element of it. And, there's different parts, but I agree with you entirely, man. The Greater North American Union, Greater Israel, even the conversation right now with what they're using to sort of at least attempt to bring together the elements against Iran in the Middle East. Like, I think all of it guides in this direction. So I guess the question is, to what end are we talking about? Is this just all globalism, or is it something else on the table?
No, we're talking about 1031 swaps all over the planet. So let's point out they just took down the oil sanctions on Russia. So Russia's now getting another 150 million plus a day in revenues. They didn't cut a deal for the EU when they did it. And if you look at their use of munitions, they have nothing left to give to NATO and the Ukraine, presumably. So now, is that not giving Putin a straight line to go take Odessa? I mean, are we standing down in the Ukraine? That's what it looks like to me.
But so what I'm curious about is how this all comes together to one cohesive agenda, if that's the implication.
Well, the U.S. takes America from Greenland down to Antarctica. You reconfigure somehow, Russia down to the Middle East on the middle. And then we should ask James about this, but China takes Taiwan and is the hegemon in the South China Sea.
Oh, so sort of a global agreement sectioning the balkanization of the
So,
world.
yeah, so it's Terry Mison's call it going from the G7 to the C4/5. The 5 being maybe Japan gets in and maybe it doesn't. I think it probably gets in, but what do you see happening with Taiwan and Asia now that the U.S. is embroiled in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, predictions, and the worst part about predicting the future is that it's the hardest thing to do. So I'm not going to make my pronouncements on it, but all of the military strategization, at least on the U.S. side, has for some weird reason been weirdly precisely focused on 2027. And all of these simulations they've run and all of these war games they've done have all centered on China taking Taiwan in 2027. I don't know why that is per se, but anyway, this is what World War is. World War is not just everyone agrees at the same time to come to some one big battlefield and duke it out. No, World War happens when there is a war over here that lets other people over here do the thing that they were already planning to do, because now that person is distracted over there, which means that person can go over here. And so, yes, it's the never-ending polycrisis that just balloons out into basically every corner of the globe. So if China was thinking of taking Taiwan, from this point on, is certainly, it seems like a prime striking territory time for them to do that because of the U.S. overextension in the Middle East and Ukraine. Or are they pulling out of Ukraine at this point? Who knows? That's what World War III is, and that's how it starts.
If they do that, James, what does that mean to Okinawa?
Well, it means that essentially we here in Japan are sitting ducks precisely because the political calculus has changed so drastically, even in just the past 5-6 months. So late last year, the then incoming Prime Minister Takaichi here happened to make some remarks in a cabinet meeting about what would Japan's role be if China went for Taiwan, and she did not follow the strategic ambiguity, whatever magic words you're supposed to say in such a situation. She went out and said something to the extent of Japan would come to the military aid of Taiwan, which is the big no-no you're not supposed to say. Huge diplomatic brouhaha, and China is absolutely livid and foaming at the mouth about it, canceling flights to Japan and all of this diplomatic fallout that's happening. So there's no doubt that Japan has painted a big target on its own back here in the past several months, presumably on the concept of the old world order, where, don't worry, Japan is firmly under the U.S. umbrella. It's the U.S. proxy in the region. Whatever happens, the U.S. has its back. But now, of course, now in 2026, we've seen absolutely every card taken off the table. Everything is now on the table for potential play. And the idea that the U.S. would have Japan's back in this is not there. So I think, China, I don't know. I genuinely do not know what Japan would do if it happened today.
So
precisely because that calculus doesn't exist.
So we're pulling the THAAD system out of South Korea to use in the Middle East. And of course, South Korea paid a terrible price for allowing us to put it in. What is the message to folks in Asia? Can you tell?
Well, it's quite obvious, but if you want me to spell it out, it's that, yes, the Uncle Sam does not have your back. You are a nice proxy location for the U.S. to stick bases and weapons, but they will pull out if and when it's strategically necessary for them to do so. But even more than that, I think what this current conflict is showing is that the THAAD, Patriot, interceptor missile, all that concept, that entire concept of warfare is outdated. exactly as, suddenly in, World War II, we're finding out that the old verities of World War I didn't exist anymore because everything had changed with the aerial attacks. Well, now we have the drone attacks, and that absolutely changes the calculus, where $1 billion radar system can be taken out by $50,000 of drones. It's a completely new stage of warfare at the moment. So I think obviously everyone and all the military strategists are still in that old mentality of the THAADs and the interceptors and that sort of thing. But I think everyone's going to have to recalculate now.
Yeah, and I think that played a major factor. And this is where mine comes back to again. I want to get into whether we think that Trump is a willing participant or how we see that playing out with the, kind of bringing it to the immediacy of it. But the drone part about in regard to the use of the weapons and the, diminishing what they have, and the argument essentially that we had to do this because they would eventually be able to surpass us with legal weapons that they can create legally, which I find an interesting argument that we have to do something illegal because they're going to legally build up their supplies. But, so how do we see that playing in with like the Trump part of this, like back to the beginning, like with all that we're discussing, or just let's put it to be nonpartisan, the U.S. government, how do we see that being a factor? And go ahead.
I think specifically Trump has been kept in this very protective, let's call it a Chabad Luba bubble. And nothing will permeate the Chabad Luba bubble as far as information that gets into Donald Trump's ears. He's constantly in the company of his son-in-law, of Howard Lutnick, number of other highly influential Chabadniks. And I think with the possible exception of his personal faith healer, there aren't too many people that really permeate that Luba bubble. And that's partially driving it. I also tend to think that he's been heavily compromised since he went to college, if not before. And so he's been groomed for this spot. Go ahead, Catherine.
So, there's an indication that they've been feeding him fake polls, which I would not be surprised if that was true. But I'll tell you what will cut through all of that bubble and fake polls and everything else is the oil price.
Well,
and
yeah,
the oil price is driving Trump crazy. And to Trump's credit, one of his good qualities is he's good at math and he does understand what those prices mean.
But
so,
I think Trump has been played hard on this. I think he went into this thinking they're not going to close the Strait of Hormuz, that this was some kind of rule, some kind of rule of engagement before they started, which is why it's always coming from Trump's side to say no, the Strait of Hormuz is open, because he knows that if he tanks the world economy over this, that's his legacy done. He's not going to be the MAGA president anymore. That's obviously gone. He's not going to be the president that fixed the economy anymore. That's obviously done. He is screwed, and they have peopled the American leadership with the greatest, crassest himbo morons that you can possibly imagine ever getting into these positions of power. I don't know why they appointed Hegseth, except to just look like an idiot. And you get to the point where these people honestly have no idea what they have done, and don't realize that they are going to be blamed for it.
So, Kit, Mike Huckabee and Hegseth, when they chose them, not now, but they look like, remember, most of the Army, the boots on the ground, come from seven southern states, and they were chosen to appeal to young recruiting from those 7 southern states. Now, I don't think that strategy worked out, but I think that was their goal. And clearly, Trump didn't want somebody who's competent. He wanted somebody who was saying yes. And I don't know if you've seen the latest headlines. I just mentioned this for amusement. Hegseth has thrown the press photographers out of the Pentagon because the staff thinks their photographs make them look bad.
It's not the murder or the indiscriminate bombing, of course. It's never that. It's the photographs from a bad angle.
Yeah. But what I think is really important about this to consider, I agree, incompetence, I think, is the most obvious part of all this. But it's a part that we have to consider in all these conversations is whether or not they're not even, like we said at first, dictating the choices, but don't even have a choice. Is this some outside element ultimately controlling these choices, or doing it in a way where Trump's not aware that it's happening? And I tend to see the Bondi, Nome, Cash, Bongino, all of it as examples of sort of stacking it to the degree one, so they just tell Trump what he wants to hear, but they're also controllable from a different angle. But also it creates an air that we are incompetent. And I think there's another angle to that. But to the point about the, Hegseth, all the ideas and the information coming from them. I think it's literally about trying to create the collapse of what the influence. And I think that it's also about Trump and the information. Back to that point, as I wonder, is this coming through Hegseth and the rest of them in order to create an air that Trump is in charge, when in reality it's coming from Israel? And is it something that he's allowed to think? It's like I want to go further on the idea of what Trump actually knows and whether it's something that he's involved in making these choices. I'm curious what you think.
I think, as we said earlier, he's the store, what do you call it? The floor manager.
But
right?
aware of it though. Like, do we think that Trump is somehow aware that he's being played? Like, is that like right now, one thing I was thinking about yesterday is that I see that I'm wondering whether Donald Trump is becoming aware that he is being played, and that might be affecting the way he sees this playing out. The oil prices is what brought that to mind, because the reporting came out, interestingly, that suddenly he was outraged, didn't even think that would happen, which makes no sense to me. How can we possibly think that they don't know that might happen? So that seemed like a false narrative to me.
Well, how would Trump not possibly think that the gas stations, that oil companies in general wouldn't take advantage of this opportunity to just egregiously price gouge people like they've done always? The price at the pump in the United States of America on March 12th has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in Iran. Not only do we not get 90 to 94% of our oil doesn't come from the Strait of Hormuz. If anything leaves the Strait of Hormuz, it takes a minimum of 25 days to get to an East Coast seaport. We haven't been in the conflict for 25 days. This is just raw, naked opportunism. And they're playing in Trump's face with it. So I'm sure he is upset about that.
I've got
Catherine,
go ahead.
Can I ask you, recently there's been a private equity liquidity crunch in the last week. Is this coincidental, or is there a tie to what's happening in the Middle East? Is this oil price related? Is it coming from the city of London? I mean, what is happening?
So this is a very excellent question. I just spent the hour before jumping on here with Tiffany Cianci doing an update. We did a 3-hour private equity overview 2 months ago, and we just did an hour update, which we'll publish next week. So since February, we had some trouble a year ago, and there's been trouble quietly in both the private credit and private equity markets, which clearly are tied at the hip. And we've seen in the last month unraveling. So you've seen redemption stopped at a couple Blue Owl funds. You've seen redemption stopped at the BlackRock fund. You've seen Blackstone fund have to come up with more equity for the second time. You've seen Cliffwater fund have to stop redemptions. That's sort of how the great financial crisis started. And there's similar sort of trouble in the private equity market. And now JP Morgan has just come out and said no more lending to private credit companies. So once upon a time, the banks made the loans, and then after the financial crisis, given the change in regulation, many of the loans started being made by the private credit companies, with the banks then financing the funds. So the banks became the wholesaler and the private credit became the retailer. So we just saw Deutsche Bank's stock slashed because of what they're doing in private credit. And if you look at the stocks of the big private equity and private credit firms, Apollo, KKR, Blackstone, they're down over 30% so far year to date. So there's real trouble. I would say there's real trouble. At the same time, they've been rolling up the small guys. And so if you want to keep consolidating into more and more billionaires, this is a great way to roll up many industries in the United States. Now they own more than 50% of the funeral homes. What they've rolled up in healthcare and hospitals is tremendous. So, when I go back to, if the 21 days and the sort of stalling of the global economy is intentional, we just put out a big study called Plunder on how you would plunder the United States. And this could be the beginning of a major push to plunder the United States. So, I think plunder is on. I've spent a lot of time in the last month at state legislators trying to lobby for protection of cash and against programmable money. And it's clear that the continuous increase of political power into billionaires and the mega rich and the sort of divide in wealth you're seeing more and more legislators just sort of do what the mega rich tell them to do. So it smells like plunder is ready to get going fiercely. But it also feels like because there's so much trouble in the markets, and now the Fed just loosened the capital requirements for the banks. So it does have that beginning of the financial crisis feeling. And I keep thinking of that movie in Wag the Dog when they can't afford headlines over what's happening with the president's politics, so they decide to have a war. So I'm not saying that's happening, but it has that feel. And I think there is tremendous push to get the control grid in place because the thing is unraveling in a variety of ways. And so, um, there's a little bit of hysteria about what's happening in terms of getting the programmable money. I would mention one other thing. Has anybody here been watching the rollout of digital tokens and stable coins? Derek, you've been watching. Okay. So the Genius Act is not, was passed last year to do stablecoins. We have a great stablecoin briefing at Solera if you're interested. But the regs won't come out till the end of this year or the beginning of next year, and the Clarity Act has stalled. There is a very fierce fight between fintech and the banks, and a very fierce fight. So it's stalled, but expected to sort of get resolved somehow in the next 2 months. The market is not waiting for that legislation. The market is exploding digital assets to trade securities as well as stable coins. And there is great debate about whether states can put up guardrails or not. That's what I've been involved in. If you look at what they're proposing to do, it looks to me, if they're successful, that you have never seen a financial bubble as big as what they intend to create with digital assets and stablecoins. So with stablecoins, they intend through the mobile payment systems to basically try and persuade every citizen they can reach globally to get off of their local currency and onto trading the equivalent of a little crypto treasury bill. And with digital assets, so I just got an offer from Coinbase that if I would put a minimum account in Coinbase, I could get 14%. Now, to say that that's an above market rate is nuts. I never looked for the details, but Coinbase has said that they are going to offer 20 times margin to trade global stocks using their digital assets. So, in theory, if that's correct, you can go in and buy one share of IBM and control 20 shares. I mean, that's unbelievable kinds of margin. I know they're planning through the stablecoin network to make tremendous loans all around the world if they can get it going. And then finally, Kraken has just made a deal with NASDAQ to do 24/7. Coinbase is doing 24/7 too, but 24/7 trading through your mobile phone and mobile payment systems with margin to trade global stocks. Now, what looks to be building is a tsunami of credit, the likes of which we've never seen, even during the financial crisis. If that's the case, they are going to blow the whole global markets in a bubble bigger than anything we've seen yet.
Bigger than derivatives?
Yep, because it's going to be combined with derivatives. Well, think about it. You've got a $250 trillion global stock and bond market, and Larry Fink, not that I trust him on anything, says he's going to create a digital twin or a digital asset for every one of them. That's 250 trillion. Now, they have been completely vague about exactly how they're going to do it and how they're going to connect fee title. And to this day, I cannot figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. But if you look at just what they've said, to me as a customer on a street level of what they're offering to do, you're talking about an enormous bubble.
Do you see a tie-in here where the justification could somehow be what happens throughout this conflict to bring a collapse, justify the change?
And I'll tell you the one that worries me the most. It's not the private credit and it's not the private equity. If they continue to they have been trying both in Europe and the United States to consolidate every small farmer and small rancher, under central control. you can't control the money unless you can control food, because we can create our own currencies. Ask Derek. Derek knows how to create his own currencies, right? We don't need their money, but they have to control food. And if you look at the push right now, the straight shutdown and the other things that's going on is doing to the American and the European farmers, this could be a major, major push to get the kind of food control they need to implement their financial model. And I hate to say it, when you buy people into programmable money, they're not going to do us by rounding us up and putting in camps. They're going to do it with honey. It's a honey trap. I offer you 14% to move, out of your local credit union or out of your local bank, and you're going to hear Ross Perot's giant sucking sound, right? Right. And here's the terrible thing. It's going to take you, if you've got your money in a community bank, they're lending that money and they're circulating money to all the small businesses and small farmers. If instead you move out of your local bank into a stable coin, all that money moves into a treasury bill and it doesn't circulate on Main Street. You've got, if that deposit is multiplying into $10 or $20, $1 multiplies to 10 or 20 loans to small business and small farmers. Now it's a sucking sound, and that, it collapses that $10 or $20.
I just have a question on that to clarify. So if the blowout happens, does that mean the ones going to get blown out are the old the local banks, and this new sort of fintech stablecoin will remain intact, and that's where they're going to want us all to be?
So the big fight right now in the Clarity Act is the fintech firms want to offer interest rate and rewards, and the banks don't want them to be able to. And that's because, essentially that money is going to leave circulating credit in the economy. If you want a local area to be successful, you want to create as many banks as you possibly can. One of the reasons Germany for many years was successful after the war is they just had mammoth amounts of small banks that ended up financing private family enterprises that were great at exporting. And that's where the industrial sort of base of Germany has developed. You put those banks out of business or consolidate, whether it's into a CBDC or these kind of stable coins, and you collapse a huge amount of the local credit, because that's what creates the money supply. So you're going to shrink the money supply by moving it all into treasury. And if you come to the United States, the thing that has really throttled the economy is more and more of the money goes up to Washington and Wall Street and then comes back with all sorts of terms and conditions and control through the treasury market. And that's shrinking small business, shrinking small farms. And that's what's shrinking the economy. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's very destructive to the economy. And that's why all of this consolidation through the federal credit is really shrinking wealth. It's creating billionaires, but it's shrinking wealth.
And all of that in and of itself is alarming. But for people who are understanding all of this, tie it back into for them to what's going on with the war and Iran.
Okay. So let me say one thing, and then I'll come back to the war. You are all too young to remember when the wall came down to Berlin. Was anybody here alive when the wall came down to Berlin? Okay. So the wall came down to Berlin, and I was at the White House, and everybody was talking about it's going to take 20 years to have treaties and get together and figure out how to merge East Germany and West Germany. And what the chancellor did in West Germany is he offered a very sweet premium to all the East Germans to come into the Deutschmark, and the country was unified in 48 hours. He unified the country through the currency. Now, the United States is planning to do that with every person around the world. So, or I shouldn't say the United States, the dollar syndicate. With stable coins, they're going to offer everybody, get off of your local currency and come into stable coins. And literally, they're going to try and tender for the global population through the currency, the same way the German chancellor did in 1989. That's what they're going to try and do.
Before James has to leave, he wanted to jump in and make a final statement, and we can continue on with that point. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That's just I have to get going in a few minutes. So I just wanted to put this out on the table because I think it's important. Obviously, everything that we're talking about, everything that we're covering here is vitally important. But I want to take the 20,000-foot overview because back at the beginning of World War II, I'm sure all of the reporting that was going on about, this and that move on the geopolitical chessboard or the monetary chessboard were fascinating and interesting, but we don't remember any of it today. What do we remember today? We remember the message that lasts. And I think to myself, if I had one message that I think is valid and vital that people understand right now, what would it be? And I cast back for, okay, so what message from World War II has survived? And I would like people to, as I will, it's been decades since I've read it, but I'm going to go and reread it, The Road to Serfdom by Hayek, which came out, it was published in 1944. So as the war is reaching its peak and starting to wind down and people are starting to think about what's coming next, and we fought these evil Nazi fascists. So what do we need to bring in to change the world once it's done? We need socialism and we need, more government control over everything. And Hayek saw exactly what the war was really about and what was really happening. It wasn't about Germany versus America or anything like that. No, it was about these ideals of different oligarchs who are fighting for different ways to manage and control people. And this was a surprisingly popular message because people saw that it cut through the garbage. It was rejected by multiple publishers, but eventually, once it got published, it became a huge smash bestseller for the University of Chicago Press. So take that for what it's worth. Anyway, go back and reread his message as he was sitting there at towards the end of World War II and penning the words, "When the course of civilization takes an unexpected turn, when instead of the continuous progress which we have come to expect, we find ourselves threatened by evils associated by us with past stages of barbarism, we blame naturally anything but ourselves. Have we not all striven according to our best lights, and have not many of our finest minds incessantly worked on to make this a better world? Have not all our efforts and hopes been directed towards greater freedom, justice, and prosperity? If the outcome is so different from our aims, if instead of freedom and prosperity, bondage and misery stare us in the face, is it not clear that sinister forces have foiled our intentions, that we are the victims of some evil power which must be conquered before we can resume the road to better things?" And he goes on to say, while all our energies are directed to bringing this war to a victorious conclusion, it is sometimes difficult to remember that even before the war, the values for which we are now fighting were threatened here and destroyed elsewhere. As in, hey guys, wake up. The real war is not the war of the bombs that are going over our heads. It's the war of our would-be leaders against all of us. And if we lose sight of that, we are going to lose the real war. This is a war for our minds more than a war about any piece of geopolitical territory. So if I were to try to summarize or distill or put forward such a message like this today, sadly, it would probably not be in book form because people do not read anymore. It would probably be in short form video form. And so I would like to direct people's attention to libertas.earth, which is now the homepage for the Philosophy of Liberty video that people may or may not be familiar with. It's now in 48 languages and counting. And it's right up there for people to take a look at. That to me
James,
is the war for everything. So,
Libertas dot what?
Libertas.earth.
It's up here. I'll include it in the show notes for everybody as well.
So that would be the message that I hope will survive these times and that people will look back in the future to remember what this war is really about.
Hear, hear. Thank you, James. Appreciate you joining.
On that note, gotta go. See you guys.
Well, Catherine, if you wanted to pick up on that point, or if we wanted to shift to some other.
So let me bring it back to the war. I think if you look at the vision, it's 2030 when we have no assets. If you look at the vision of completely flipping to a serfdom model or technocracy model, whichever you want to call it, I just think this is, somebody said at the beginning, this is part of the reset. This is the next phase of the reset, trying to get to that place of central control. And so my focus is on the programmable money, but there are many other pieces to the control grid. We have a collection at Solari called the Fast Approaching Digital Control Grid. And whether we're looking at the incompetence and then the plunder of America, or we're looking at bottlenecking the trade routes, like putting down the straits to further consolidate food and chip manufacturing and energy. I do think this is part of the reset, and and they're pushing to get that control done by 2030.
Well, I'll ask you and anybody else if you see how this may, like, one of the thoughts that come to my mind, and this is what I was saying earlier, is that I don't want to, make this about the, point being is I think that we all can see this connects. My mind would go further in the way that I see it as potentially connected to the network state agenda, the Freedom City, Smart City, Great Reset, all of that. So, Catherine or anybody else, do you think that there's a connection there between the idea of, the per nomos capital funded sort of Prospera network state, like reimagining of the way our society operates point, or is that something separate as you see it?
Can I just throw it? I just want to kind of add a point to what Catherine and what Jorge was saying earlier about the connection between, the things we saw during COVID and of course, Agenda 2030, and how we know that whether it's a pandemic, scandemic, or war or fake alien invasion or whatever they want to pull out, it's all aiming in the same direction to move towards these systems, like what Catherine's talking about, programmable money, and then of course track and trace society. And I do think it's interesting, as Jorge touched on earlier, that I think it was you that mentioned like how like the Strait of the Hormuz is already bringing back this work from home in Vietnam and Denmark and other places, and they're even saying like, oh, it's bringing back this familiar thing like we saw during COVID. They're not being very subtle about it. I also just want to mention, and I'm sure I'm not the only one here thinking about it, of course, not with any sort of predictions or anything like that, but what I feel is a very real concern about a false flag event coming very soon. In the coming weeks. I've also been sort of in the back of my mind, if it doesn't happen in the next couple of weeks, which let's pray it doesn't, the 250th anniversary of the United States is coming up this summer. I have felt for a long time that if they wanted to pull something off then, why not do it on this big anniversary that Trump and his administration are going to make a big deal about? And of course, obviously, we saw this attack on the synagogue today. That's going to be great for people who want to talk about anti-Semitism spreading. And yet just this last couple of days, ABC News reporting Iranian sleeper cells are getting activated. I remember they reported that a year ago too, and now they're bringing it back up again. So all the sort of pieces are being laid for us to see something. And it could be, if they do go with this sleeper cell stuff where there's an attack at major cities all around the US and, they shut the country down. I don't know. Again, I'm praying not, but we know these people are psychopathic. And I think whatever path they use, whichever path to Persia, they're going to try to get, that same end goal that we know that they've been working on, whether it comes through false flags, whether it comes through messing with energy and with oil flow and then using that as an excuse. So that's kind of where my mind has been at lately.
I've even seen them use the phrase "new normal" as well recently, Financial Times. But I've heard some people have chimed in that this is not verified, but where some of the Iranian missiles fell into Israel, some of those locations were maybe geared for 15-minute city type. So, that kind of stuff needs to be verified. So it'd be almost like Iran is helping Israel set up its 15-minute cities and vice versa.
That came up before as well, that point, because that argument there was more so of a collaboration of sort of like you bomb here, you bomb there, and we'll both back away kind of idea. And that was one of they kind of chose the locations that would help them in that direction. I heard the same thing. Interesting.
They had a sort of quasi relationship like that going back to Syria in 2015, like when Trump notionally destroyed Syria's chemical weapons in 2018 with strikes. They radioed ahead to say, we're going to strike there, basically make sure there's nobody there. And then after Soleimani was killed, Iran did the same thing. We're going to strike these places. Please don't put any troops there because we really don't want to kill anybody. There was a push and pull and that kind of thing for years.
Yeah, and I find that really interesting. And I don't think that's necessarily all working together. Like there's that, I think that happens in even adversarial positions, but it's worth very much considering that. In regard to the point that Derek brought up about the false flag overlap, I find this really interesting that before like the last couple of days of this big push, this came out on the 6th claiming the White House was blocking an intelligence report warning of that very thing, which to me just rang wildly hollow. Like how, in what past point had they ever not been like waving what they could in front of your face? So I was curious to think about that. Like, is that more of
that's trying to weaponize the Streisand effect? That's exactly what that is.
Yeah. But I'm curious if anybody else thought that was maybe an example of the opposite. Like, is this, like we were saying earlier, that maybe Donald Trump is in fact, seeing how he might be being played and trying to pull that back? Like, that's one of the thoughts that I had on that.
So I think one thing we can do for our audience is help them to see the absurdity of many of the cover stories that are happening. So if you look at how much surveillance the United States has funded and operates, it's extraordinary, the surveillance. And I remember, Ryan, when you did the briefing for us on the monthly legislative briefing about the control model, I think you scared a lot of people to death because the surveillance is so extraordinary and invasive. But somehow thousands of Iranian third column can come into the country and support themselves with income and no problem living, and somehow the United States can't do anything about it. You know, that's a contradiction. The contradiction that an empire that can slant drill for purposes of oil drilling or mining, you know, down hundreds or thousands of yards, if not miles, can't deal with tunnels under Gaza, and on and on and on. Or a country that it spends $1 trillion a year on military can't keep the straits open, even though that's the primary function of anybody who runs a reserve currency. So the cover story of incompetence again and again and again and again has reached a level of absurdity that is ridiculous. You know, we're back to black teenagers are bringing drugs into the city, but the military can't stop it from coming across the border, right? You know, so
We've
all of
spent
these,
a fortune on Iron Dome, but we can't stop hang gliders with lawnmower motors getting
Right.
into our airspace.
right?
We
right.
decimated the Iranian Navy, but there are ghost fleets off the coast of California loaded down with drones ready to take out San Francisco and LA.
There you go. I think there's got to be, I don't know, it's almost like we need to do a comedy show on the ridiculousness of the incompetence cover story.
Well, but so what do we think?
That's
this
called AM Wake Up, and it's live Monday through Thursday, 7 to 10 on the West Coast. That's what we do. It's the whole
It's
point
one of
show.
the fascinating things about propaganda is studying contradictions, because sort of a flag of any propaganda drive will be a massive contradiction, which A, claims that the people saying it are totally competent to know exactly what they're doing, and also have totally fucked up and messed it all up completely.
So has anybody here ever heard the story of the Dog King? So Michael Yan put me onto this. Michael and his wife Masako came and spent a couple weeks with us in Netherlands. We had a wonderful time. But there is a myth, it's a story, and I think it's Swedish, where I think it was the Swedes or the Norwegians captured the Danes, and they wanted to beat the Danish population into submission. You can find this on the internet. And so they created a dog. They made a dog the king, and passed laws that said if anybody doesn't treat the dog as if he's the real king, they'll be murdered. They'll be killed. So you had the whole population had to pretend that the dog was really the king, and if not, they would be subject to terrible punishments. And I have to tell you both, we are progressively dealing with dog kings in the United States.
Okay, so again, the same point to the other point. What are we seeing the implication is in that, right? That this is, actually, before I even say that, but there's an opening. Let me play this clip that ties together the 2 points of both the threat, false flag, and incompetence as well with what Trump has to say here, which we can all collectively laugh at because it's insane and a nothing answer, but also seems to suggest that they're doing nothing about what they know is a threat.
Iran sleeper cells there could be inside the U.S. right now.
I have been, and a lot of people came in through Biden with this stupid open border. But we know where most of them are. We've got our eye on all of them, I think.
Is it dozens?
They came in through the open border policies of Sleepy Joe Biden.
He basically repeats that one more time. But the point is, we know where they are, maybe some of them, and we're watching them. I think that's kind of an insane answer. What they either do something or don't, or, so that's this incompetence angle, is that Trump? I also find it really hard to believe that Trump would intentionally make himself look stupid. I don't even feel like he's borderline capable of that with how narcissistic he is. But, where do we place all this? What does it truly mean, the incompetence we're seeing?
I suppose you'd say that, the deep state is a tiger that an awful lot of narcissists think they can ride. And Trump right now is where Hillary was in November 2016. He's been screwed over by the machine that he thought he was running. I don't think he expected this to go this badly. I think he expected to have won his war by now.
I kind of agree.
And I think he feels like a fool, and he probably should.
And so from there, it becomes, what does he do now? You know, is he being blackmailed Epstein file style? Is he unable to respond, or is he now suddenly pushing back? Which is what I'm trying to, consider with what we're seeing, because the actions don't line up in a lot of ways, even within what we're discussing. And so you wonder whether that's about to shift, and if it does, what will that look like? Because look, it's pretty clear that everything they're doing in Iran is wildly against U.S. interests and what American people want.
So at one point we had a cartoon of a bus, and there's a guy driving the bus, and then his steering wheel doesn't connect to the wheels, and downstairs there's another guy driving the bus, and his steering wheel does connect to the wheels. So Trump is the guy up front, and he's got to explain to people what's happening wherever the bus goes, because he doesn't want to admit he's not driving the bus. And I don't know if you see the one where he says, they ask him, is it a war and is it an excursion? He says, well, it's an excursion, but it's also a war, but it's an excursion. And and that's what happens when you're driving the bus and your steering wheel doesn't connect. I don't think he knows what's going to happen next.
Right. I always use the Maggie Simpson analogy from the Simpsons opening, with a little fake steering wheel, the same point, just not really in charge. But, I don't know. I don't feel like this adds up for me, because I feel like that Donald Trump's the kind of person that he's either completely compromised and unable to do something, or would be doing it all the way he wants it. A middle ground doesn't line up for me, but where we are right now, it's hard to tell, So, I mean, I think there's a lot of other angles we can go into. I'm not sure how long everybody wanted to go today, but, I think that we've talked about a lot of really important parts of this that aren't necessarily the surface level, because we could have discussed about the illegalities of how it started, or, and I honestly think as we started, I think those are very self-evident right now. I think people see the obviousness of that. And so I'm glad we focused on sort of the bigger picture here about where it ends up going. So if we want to kind of go into that to wrap in general, where do we think this will end up? What where's it going to go from here?
I think a lot of the people like Trump, or most politicians, are just forced to react and go along with the deep state. And there's a lot of chatter in the comments about false flag, and again, the sleeper cells. What I experienced a few weeks ago here in Mexico, it almost felt like I was just driving to church and almost driving around half a dozen narco blockades, and they're talking about Iranian sleeper cells coming up through Mexico. And it's almost like, what if they were, that was an Operation Gladio. They were practicing for what they might unleash on the U.S. And then, talk of tactical nukes. And so I think if they're going to do something, it's possible they might launch something on the level of 9/11 or COVID, in the sense of, biological or chemical weapons to eviscerate what's left of the Constitution. And then some people are putting out that maybe this will be used to take down America. And when I see Netanyahu today saying, what did he say? We will make it to the return of the Messiah. And it's almost cartoonish. And myself as a Christian, I feel like this Zionism, political Zionism, that's attached to this American fake Christianity, it's almost like it's also trying to take down Christianity with it. And then this will maybe all blow up and be used to take down the U.S., to move towards the multipolar, as I call it, totalitarian, federalized multipolar world state. I don't know. So
I agree. That's where I see this aiming as well. And I think it's alarming how clear it seems to be that it's drifting in that direction. The sleeper cell point, to focus on that, since you brought it up, I think it's clear that I don't see in any world where that would be in the interest of Iran. In any way, whether it's publicly known they did it, whether it was done secretly and not known. I don't see how that in any way lines up with what they would want. Is it in their interest at all? So the worry is that that's exactly what we've always seen, that this is done to make Americans fearful, to paint a picture of what they want you to think the big boogeyman is of Iran, even though most everything they say about Iran, and that's not to say that they're good guy versus bad guy, but they just lie about them. It's it's provable. So I very much worry what that will lead to, right? The creation of that, collapse of this, to lead to the larger point we were making today. Go ahead.
Well, the most interesting thing of the result of any false flag would be how they actually cover it. Because right now, I would be inclined to think that any false flag that happened in America, most papers wouldn't say this is Iran's fault. I think they would say this is Donald Trump's fault for starting the war in the first place. I think that's the place where we're at right now. And yeah, I can see it being like, this is the last American war, essentially. So unless there is some kind of awful collapse into a kind of civil war, which could happen. I mean, they've teased a second civil war in America for years, and I could see that eventually just organically breaking out. But yeah, I think 5 years down the line, we will be talking about the ex-American empire. And I think they have started that process now.
Well, if the United States does devolve into civil war, everyone come out to Northern California. We'll reclaim the state of Jefferson, and we'll go from there. We'll go from there.
Sounds good.
No, this is absolutely a march to, balkanized one world global tyranny. I find it very difficult to see it any other way, especially since it seems like the last 25 years of global war on terror was priming the pump for this particular conflict. Everything that's been thrown at us along the way, as far as the digital surveillance state and the technocratic prison goes, is part of this eventual partitioned one world government entity. And what Catherine refers to as the B system is being rolled out in every country. There are 193 countries, and 193 of them signed on to a handful of different global compacts that all effectively implement the one world government style policies and eventually currency without effectively coming out and making a statement that this is one unified body.
Right, and that includes Iran. That includes Iran.
Yeah, exactly, 100. Yes.
All the world leaders that were unlikely to sign up to that agreement all suddenly died of heart attacks in March 2020.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly in Africa, right?
Yeah.
Well, the religious part of this, which we really didn't get into, which is, very clear. It's not even being, that was something that was sort of a conspiracy theory until now it's being proudly discussed by Hegseth, that this is a religious war. This is Armageddon. We're fighting God's war. And there's tons of military personnel are outraged about that. But you get two angles of it, right? You've got the Jewish Zionist perspective of this, which ultimately is, the Messiah has never come, and ultimately the second coming from the Western Christian perspective. But what's interesting is this is an important point to leave you with as we wrap this up, is that we have people in the Trump administration like Hegseth or Percent, they're religious Zionists, and the belief being that the West has to essentially collapse before the end times. And that's a strange thing to somehow make reconcile with America first. I think that's worth considering. But
but
who's been strangely absent from all that talk, of course, is J.D. Vance. He has shut himself up in a bunker somewhere. He doesn't want anything to do with this.
He's very embarrassed about it, I'm sure. But here's the thing: the bankers always, all wars are bankers' wars, and it's really central bankers, not bankers. But Brian, they can't just say, "Look, we're going to kill you and steal their stuff," right? They need the mandate of heaven suggests that you need some philosophy that describes why you have the mandate of heaven. And that's why they get all these crazy people in kooks and pay them a lot of money to say this crazy stuff. That's where Paula White comes from. And it's like flack. It's info flack.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if we are talking about the decline of America, then anybody with any sense doesn't want to be captain of a sinking ship. So they're going to appoint disposable morons. I mean, it's just the way it is.
And this comes back around to the 2016 argument that a lot of us were floating around, that Trump was picked to bring down this country. And the administration ended, we moved on. Oh, maybe not. Well, they think longer than one administration apparently, and I think obviously, I think that's a very important thing to consider, whether this is that exact long term. And interestingly, as we all seem to somewhat agree on, this aims toward the Great Reset, or whatever we want to call it. It's the Republican flavor, or whatever they need to coerce you with right now. It goes in that very same direction. That's again why I think that connection point to the larger sort of tech-led mindset to these governments are part of that. That's just the way I see that, though. But either way, the Great Reset seems to be in full effect.
And I just add on the apparent religious Christian religious I can't say it of some of these leaders. I just can't but think I don't think some of it is genuine. If we look at George Bush back in the day, skull and bones. This guy's on the face of it not a Christian, but he says God told me to invade Iraq. So I think some of these guys believe in other things. And before we do leave, it's a shame Derek left us, but I think we do have to mention his debate with Naomi Wolf, and I couldn't get past 10 minutes when he mentioned Operation Ajax, which is a fact. You can read the 30-page CIA document. And he mentioned Greater Israel, where last week Yair Lapid was asked, yes, we want to go to biblical boundaries, Greater Israel. And Naomi Wolf is like, well, you presented evidence. You presented a argument without evidence. I'm like, what are you talking about? And so
in the opening statement, is that what you mean? Is that what you're talking? Yeah, no, she had zero concept of even the most basic ideas of what a debate is supposed to be. She, if my theory is that about 20 seconds into Derek's opening statement, she realized she was in way over her head and went to underhanded tactics of trying to destroy credibility, character assassination, ad hominem, gish galloping, interrupting, and then she did this weird, like, talk down, condescending thing that was almost like misandrist in its delivery, and I believe it was intentionally delivered that way to try to bait Derek into some sort of reaction, not realizing that if you're actually self-funded independent media for as long as Derek has been, something that elementary and banal isn't going to break you.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that Naomi Wolf has always been a good friend and someone I liked, and this is completely out of character.
Yeah.
That seems to be the general consensus, Catherine, all around. Yeah.
We watched the live view, and I agree, and I think it's there for people to watch. It speaks for itself, and I was taken aback by even opinions I even had. It was shocking to me, and it's worth watching for everybody. And the question is why? The evidence is there. I mean, the great point you made right there about I mean, is anybody pretending like we don't see the Zionist element to this point, or Israel's involvement with Iran war? It's amazing the pushback you get from her and others that if you simply bring up Israel's involvement, it's somehow like here we go. And it's like, and so it shows you this unwillingness to engage with the reality of the situation for whatever reason. So, people should watch it if they want to. Go ahead, Catherine.
I would make a suggestion, because I don't know this, because I haven't talked to Naomi about it, but I would strongly recommend you watch one of my favorite documentaries in the world. It's called Defamation. Has anybody here seen it? It was made by an Israeli filmmaker, and it was his exploration of what is anti-Semitism and where does it come from. And it's quite extraordinary. It was Documentary of the Year on the Solari Report. I was so impressed with it. But it will help you understand why there is a real terror among many people in the Jewish community who feels that if Israel is determined to be less than perfect or less than excellent, that somehow it will put them at terrible risk. And you see how that philosophy has gotten marketed and inculcated. And
right.
I will say this: I have very dear long-term friends who, in the Jewish community, who right now do feel terror about what's happening and believing they'll be blamed. And I keep telling them, look, we're dealing with a criminal syndicate here, and it shouldn't be interpreted as being representative of the Jewish community, but the Jewish community is used as a shield by that criminal syndicate. Defamation describes that brilliantly as to how that's been engineered.
Right.
And so I do think it's very important, I feel, that people in the Jewish community not live in terror, and anything we can do to get them out of that would be worthwhile.
I agree.
So.
I mean, and this is a gigantic conversation that we've all probably tackled in our own way in over however many years. But it's worth just noting that it's very important to see that difference and recognize that what she's describing there is how Zionism uses that as a shield, as you're discussing. And I just think that, at least that's speaking for myself, and I think that's very important to see how that is, the trap about creating the idea that the Jewish people at large are somehow the only responsible element in all of this, when in reality it's the Zionism overlap to all of these things, and I think that's really important to understand. And as I agree with you entirely, Catherine, the ultimate point is that, there's that push to create that framing in order to get the pivot from the real focal point, and yes, there are aggressive action, and it's it's unjustified,
I don't know if you've ever heard me. I don't know if you've ever heard me say this, but, I'm from Philadelphia, and Netanyahu graduated from Cheltenham High in Philadelphia. So I just see him as a Philly mobster. I don't see him I don't even raise it to a philosophy like, Zionism is a philosophy. I just see him as a criminal syndicate. But any kid in Philadelphia would have told you, never give a nuclear bomb or a nuclear arsenal to a kid from Cheltenham High School. Never do that. So
there you go.
Anyway.
Well,
I probably shouldn't give a nuclear arsenal to any kids at all, to be honest. I mean,
yeah. Go ahead.
But I think people come at that from the other way as well. If you start talking about Iran, you'll get an awful lot of people saying, "How can you say this? Think about the poor civilians in Iran." And there is a mental trap we can all fall into where we don't separate the idea of nations and peoples from their governments.
Right.
When we talk about Iran and Israel, we're talking about the governments of Iran and Israel, and we'll just say Israel as a sort of shorthand, and we'll say Iran as a shorthand. But there is an understanding, and obviously I think most people have it instinctively, and I think we all share it, that the people in those governments have much more in common with each other than they do with the people they represent. And we have much more in common with the ordinary people of Israel or Iran than we do with our governments.
Yep. Well, yeah, exactly. That's so offensive to the people who think otherwise, interestingly enough, which speaks for itself. But yeah, I think it's very important to see that. And, I think this is a good place to kind of wrap. And if anybody else, if we want to have any final thoughts, jump in. Otherwise, I think it's a good place to kind of wrap up. Anybody any final thoughts? All right. Well, it's been a good.
I have one final thought, actually, just one.
He came in like Columbo.
James ended with a quote, and I would like to end with a quote as well from a book published about the same time. It's George Orwell, 1984. I think it's a very important quote. "War, it will be seen, is now a purely internal affair. The war is waged by each ruling group against its own subjects, and the object of that war is not to make or prevent conquests, but to keep the structure of society intact." I think that's something we should all think about.
Absolutely, we are. Absolutely. Well, good. We'll leave it there for today. Plenty more IMA panels coming your way, guys. I'd imagine we're probably going to have another conversation about Iran if this continues. So thank you all for being here. And as always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead, Catherine. I didn't mean to cut you off. Oh, she's saying thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. I know how hard it is to organize these, and I think you do a wonderful job. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time, guys.